Okay, and this is, only got, let me think, we've got one more class after this, which is on astrology, one on labyrinth, and then we're doing a summary class, which will be very different than the summary that we did a year ago. We keep changing things, and you can judge for yourself, but this actually the same number of classes, like 35 classes for year one and 35 classes for year two. So this is if there's 3 left, this is the 31st class. Okay, no, 31st class. So anyway.
And we're thinking of doing a summer class. So we'll start planting those seeds with you now to see if people are interested.
Yeah.
What we've thought about, but we're open. A lot of people had all kinds of ideas last year of what they would like, and it just didn't work out because Bart had to be away. But we're thinking of doing Answer to Job.
That'd be really interesting.
For people who aren't tired of Jung yet. But we would ask people to read, because it's just that much richer if you really read the material for yourself. And it's not a long book. It's a relatively thin book, but it's a unique take on this. I categorize it as a myth in the Joseph Campbell sense. We don't have our Joseph Campbell fan here tonight.
So,
but so we're just starting to plant those seeds.
right.
Really, and that will probably create more discussion if we all read the book.
Right.
That's what we would hope.
Yeah, I'm just going to mute everybody. Marjorie is going to take over now.
Oh,
Yeah, it's your class.
I don't know if
So what would you like to start with? Do you want to do the
well,
Liz Green?
No.
No.
We're going to do that next week.
Okay, what are we going to do?
We were going to do the 2 videos.
The 2 videos. So let's go to the 2 videos. Here we are. There they are.
The guy on the left.
Hold on, they can't see anything.
Okay. There's 2 astrologers in this video talking to each other. They're kind of talking shop.
So this guy here on the left is Hand, H-A-N-D.
He was in the video last week when he was much younger. This is about 20 years later. He was one of the authorities being canvassed. And now he's been a leading astrologer since, like the 60s. And Stephen Forrest is sitting on the right, and he's more or less interviewing Robert Hand. But it's a kind of unusual dialogue between 2 peers.
These are 2 astrologers talking shop. Okay, so you get the pattern of 2 very experienced people, just to show you what it's like to do astrology.
And they're at a convention. There are these national and international conventions that are usually held in a hotel, and people come and stay in the hotel or nearby. And then they have, various rooms, and there'll be sales of books and computers and services, and sort of like a balcony area usually between sessions. And there might be 2 or 3 tracks at the same time of classes that are usually by published authors. And these 2 guys would be a real catch to have at a convention like this. And that's where they are in Seattle. You can see that drop.
The Space Needle in the background.
In the background. So that's sort of the context of what they're doing. And because they're both there at the same place at the same time, they decided to have a recorded conversation. So it's kind of informal, but you get this kind of fly on the wall view of what 2 really seasoned astrologers who helped modernize it. They really helped bring it into the 20th century when it almost died out, really, because of the church. when the church had promoted it, at some point they even mentioned that at one point the church ran all the universities, and in Dante's time it was required study at any university to study astrology. It was considered part of being well-rounded and just having a background, and I believe it was under humanities. And they didn't really separate astronomy from astrology at that point. So anyway, you can.
Okay, so here we
this is
go.
Robert Hand again on the left and Stephen Forrest on the right.
Oops, let me
What do I think about the two zodiacs?
go back to the beginning.
6 years of difference, 6 years and a month, actually, almost exactly between us. And of course, that's increasingly insignificant as we approach the three-digit range. We've seen a lot of astrological history. We've lived through an incredibly powerful period in the history of astrology. I think our generations, plural, existing now in some ways have maybe even saved astrology from complete oblivion. But at the same time, we've seen this diversification of voices within the world of astrology. When I was a young astrologer, we would argue about which house system to use, for example. And now I attend an astrology conference and I hear a Hellenistic astrologer, I hear a Renaissance astrologer. For a while I was hearing cosmobiologists. They seem to have gotten a little more scarce, but they're still around. And I often don't even know what they're talking about. I'm a professional astrologer. I've made my living at it all my life. I have a system that works and a large clientele, but I'm not even in a position to argue any longer with half of the people in the astrological world. And by argue, I don't mean express anger, but have a subject that we both understand and both get our teeth into it and discuss. I have this kind of frightening image, frightens me, I don't know if it should, of each little system of astrology on its own island, and it's like the expanding universe, and the islands are floating over the horizon. I was up at the podium here in Norway a couple of years ago, raised this subject and asked if there were any Vedic astrologers, and there always had been. None had shown up. They're not here anymore, and so we have this Tower of Babel kind of thing going on, and here's the really grown-up point, the crux of what I would like your opinion on. I don't know if that's a problem or not. There's certainly not the idea that the right answer is the holy grail of one true astrology. That even if there is such an astrology, we don't need crusaders beheading each other, on that basis. And this each group seems to be discovering interesting and powerful things, and yet the sense of cohesion in the community is gradually getting eroded by this. There's legitimate differences, intellectual differences, values differences, and so on. And then inevitably there's a fair amount of name calling, and we have to decide which zodiac is correct or which house system is correct. And the people in the bottom half of the class get ugly about it, as usual. You're in the top half of the class, and I guess I want to know what your thoughts are about this, and whether you think it's a problem or not.
Well, it's certainly inconvenient because we would like to have a unified discipline. But my experience of the astrological community throughout my entire astrological career has been diversity, because I come out of the Northeastern world, which was cosmobiologists, Uranians, siderealists, conventional astrologers. And there was no more harmony then than there is now in that community, except everybody got along, but everybody agreed to disagree. But the phenomenon you're referring to is due to something different. those movements, or those groups back in the 70s and the early 80s were the product of long-standing school differences that had existed for most of the 20th century, or at least a good several decades before then. This one is partly due to a huge influx of new information about the history of astrology and the old techniques. And I would say the battle situation was in some respects worse about 10 years ago, because you had what looked like militant Hellenistic astrologers, which is the last thing we need, militant this, militant that. And I noticed at first in Britain, a change of a few years ago, that the last time I went to an AA conference, the traditionalists and the moderns were talking to each other. And they were exchanging ideas, and they were supporting each other. And a synthesis seems to be beginning. And here I have noticed one of the more prominent Hellenistic astrologers, Chris Brennan, who used to be somewhat condescending to modern astrology and its like, has started voicing his interest in the same issues. He did a very splendid job of that in the workshop he did last Friday morning, where he had a predictive technique that was almost embarrassingly effective. And he said, I like to believe we have choice, and this is causing me some philosophical problems, this technique. But the point is, he wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. This is something new is happening.
Good.
And as far as which is the right way is concerned, I've never taken the position of there being a right way, and I don't expect I ever will. But I do believe that raising over the entire history of astrology in the Middle East and West, at least, Hindu is a tougher nut to crack because it's so different. I do see. Well, let me tell you what I do, and this is why I'm optimistic, because I think people are beginning to get it. If you look at any one part of astrology, any one school or historical period, you got the classic blind man and the elephant routine. Somebody's got the legs, somebody's got the trunk, somebody's got an ear. And when you start looking over the history of astrology from the earliest records we have, you begin to see the elephant.
Nice.
And I think people are beginning to realize that what is required is an intelligent synthesis, not one school winning. And the intelligent synthesis, I think, is happening. And certainly it's, while I teach medieval astrology quite happily, because you've got to learn it before you can synthesize out of it. My own personal work is entirely a synthesis. It's a bit of Hellenistic, a bit of medieval, quite a bit of modern. I still use a 90-degree dial on occasion. I'm one of those cosmobiology types, although I don't use it as much as I used to. And
That's what my teacher
the
was.
end result seems to be simply a more powerful astrology. But of course, powerful with respect to what? That's one interesting question. That's what I lectured on this morning, as a matter of fact. What are we trying to do? And so I don't think the situation is getting worse. I think it was for a while, but I don't think it is anymore, because everybody seems to realize that everybody has a portion of the closest thing we're going to get to the truth, and is working on it. Now, the Hindu business is another matter entirely. Not because I think Hindu astrology is wrong, I don't, but using techniques that I think are genuinely mutually exclusionary, you get the same results. That bothers me.
A serious logical problem.
Yeah. I mean, how can you have two different zodiacs where most of the time you get different rulers of the houses and different aspect systems? And the only answer I can give at the moment is it's so different that it might just be possible they're both true. Or at least they contain a very substantial chunk of the truth.
Evidence seems strong that they're both true.
Yeah.
The last time I had a personal astrological reading, I should preface this by saying the whole idea of having a reading is a difficult concept for me because I
can
get
believe
so
that.
caught up in my expert's hat and
Yeah.
quotation marks around the word, of course. But somebody sits down and does any form of modern Western astrology, I'm going to be busy correcting their papers. It makes me the world's worst client. So the last time I had a reading, I intentionally sought out a Vedic astrologer, a Swami, over in England, just because I didn't speak the language, and that would shut up my inner expert. And it was eye-opening. Just the plain English bottom line was quite helpful. But it led me to that same confusion of, how could two different zodiacs both be true?
Yeah.
When people will raise this question with me, and I quote a wise old sage very often by the name of Robert Hand, who once in a lecture said, which is truer, French or German? Which is probably my favorite line of yours of all time.
Well, it's because we are, in fact, dealing with different languages.
Yes.
And there is a really mystical sort of answer one can give here, which is a language is initiated between two intelligences.
Yes.
And there is no reason why the universal soul, or whatever you want to call it, should have the same language when he speaks with every different culture.
Exactly. Diana Stone here a few years ago gave a wonderful, wonderful talk on this subject and said, we're doing divination, which means being in conversation with the divine mind, participating with the divine mind. And God, for lack of a better word, speaks many, many languages and doesn't care which one we speak, but make a deal with God, said she, which language you want to speak. Now, this leads to an interesting point so I've made a deal personally with the universe to speak the language that the term evolutionary astrology probably captures it better than anything. And it works. It works very well. But it's very different language than say cosmobiology or Hellenistic astrology. Now, Diana Stone's point, make a deal with the divine to speak a language, but don't ask the divine to speak many languages, or don't change which language you're speaking midstream. Remain true to the coherent heart of a belief system or a symbol system that works, and that we weaken our approach when we muddy the water. I was encouraged, actually, this will seem to contradict what I just said, but very encouraged in the more fundamental way by what you said about your observation that there's more synthesis occurring. That just feels spiritually healthy for the community. But I would also add another observation. I've heard astrologers, often younger astrologers, who get excited about various branches and produce what sounds like a muddle to me. It's like they're in too many different language systems and viewpoints at once, and bouncing back and forth between, prediction in the rigid sense and choice, and even dancing among the two zodiacs. And I have a line I use with my students a lot. They come to memorize it because they hear it so much. The line is, if you are slightly confused, your client will be utterly confused.
I actually have a pretty powerful insistence in my own work that there's a coherent theoretical pattern behind it.
Yes.
And that, I think, actually, in some respects, is more important at this time than the empirical observation, because throughout the 20th century and the 21st, and I didn't leave out 21st on accidentally. I left it up for a moment on purpose. It just really got going in the 20th century.
Yes.
I mean, you didn't hang out in the New York astrological community.
No,
I did. And people were coming up with weird stuff every week, some totally new revolutionary technique, none of which had any kind of philosophical or theoretical coherence at all. And people tried. it wasn't so much a babble. Did you ever play with colored modeling clay when you were a kid?
Yeah, sure.
And you mix the colors together, and for a while you had this beautiful modeling clay with all these colors, right?
Yeah.
And eventually you had gray.
Yes. My fear, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that stuff was getting rapidly toward gray, all right.
Yes.
There are places where you can mix them because it's not so much that they're different languages, that are using different subsets of the same language.
Mhm.
That is to say, they're coming out of a similar theoretical foundation.
Yeah.
But I'm inclined not to respect an idea that makes no sense. I don't mean linguistically, I mean theoretically.
Yeah.
Linguistically, obviously. The main reason why I support this influx of new ideas from the past, well, two. One, they didn't die out because they've been found wanting. They died out because people forgot, and they forgot because civilizations were destroyed,
Yes.
books were burned,
Yeah.
and the most recent near death of astrology was the 18th century, when it almost died.
Yeah.
And when it came back, it came back largely in the English-speaking world through one astrologer, John Partridge, who played an incredibly pivotal role in the development of English astrology. Unfortunately, it was mostly negative because he just started throwing out things that he didn't understand and he couldn't make any sense out of them. And he was kind of a pseudo-rationalist. I say pseudo because rationale wasn't obvious at all. And in the 19th century, when the revival began, he was the foundation of it.
Yeah.
Then Alan Leo came along in the early 20th century, and from his theosophical perspective, turned against the rigid deterministic orientation of Partridge and descendants, but he didn't do anything about going back to see what the older astrology might have been like. And so what happened is there's a great deal of 20th century astrology where the language, it isn't so much 20th century astrology was wrong, as the language was impoverished. And it's the enrichment of the language along with a slowly evolving theoretical structure that I think is the sign of hope.
Yes, yes.
Because in 20th century astrology, there has not really been any clear understanding of what a ruler, from the medieval point of view, there's never been a clear understanding of what a ruler was versus an occupant. And throughout my whole 20th century experience, I found people using them more or less indiscriminately.
Yes.
In medieval astrology, up through and past Lilly, there's quite a rigorous distinction. And I got a hint of it long before I found the evidence. And I mentioned it to an astrologer in Boston. Oh, no, I don't see anything like that at all. Well, you don't see what you're not looking for. And I have found this to be the basis of a great deal of sophistication in the language. And it doesn't contradict modern astrology. It simply, instead of having a vocabulary of 300 words, it's got a vocabulary of maybe a couple of thousand now. I don't mean literally words, but I'm speaking analogically. And I think this is a huge positive step. Now, one thing that I do not have any great fondness for is the re-arising renaissance. There we go, renaissance of deterministic astrology.
Yeah, good for you.
I got one very compelling reason. I've never seen anybody do it. I mean, I mentioned this morning that I think I did mention that in this lecture. Yeah, that there is a small group of astrologers who believe that the inability of astrologers to precisely forecast the future is due either to a defect in the training of the astrologer or in the techniques he's using. Wrong, yeah. I talked about 3 different factors that determine results, one of which is will, causation, and bloody chance. And that third one we have to stop overlooking. That's what the lot of fortune is about, by the way.
Yeah, I attended your lecture
Chance
about
factor,
that,
yeah. And anybody who says that astrology should be capable of predicting which direction you're going to take when you walk out of a building is nuts.
Yeah.
It's a belief system, and not even, I mean, even by religious standards, it's a pretty bad belief system.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of my most exciting voyages along these lines is you and I are both into the idea of the astrology of self-realization.
Yes.
And I found a great deal of ancient philosophy that pertains to it.
Mm-hmm.
They agreed. In fact, I read a passage this morning from Iamblichus where they agreed that the astrologers had really messed things up by talking about good and bad aspects, good and bad planets.
They sound like me.
Yeah, they say these are all serenely revolving in their circles, contemplating the one and the good.
Yeah.
They're not going to mess up our lives.
Yeah. Yes.
What happens is we mess up their energies.
Yes. Yes.
And so the responsibility lies squarely with us. And one of the reasons why I'm excited about this is for people like yourself and modern astrologers who are into this kind of astrology, this is not news. I mean, it may be, the details might be, but the general principle certainly isn't. To fundamentalist traditionalists, this is news.
Yes.
The idea that there is actually a strong philosophical stream, particularly in Hellenistic. In the medieval, it got kind of diluted because you could be burned at the stake for holding those sorts of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And well, not many were, just one actually on it.
Giordano Bruno, right?
That wasn't for astrology. That was for. Do you know the story of what he actually was?
No. I always thought it was. I know he was an astrologer.
No, usually it's told because he espoused the heliocentric system. That is not historically accurate. Here's what happened. He actually had first of all, he was one of the first to agree that the stars were other suns, and the universe was infinite. And he saw no reason why there shouldn't be planets orbiting those suns. And he saw no reason why there shouldn't be sentient life forms around on those planets. Why did Jesus just come here? And how can you possibly have the only true religion when there's this infinite universe full of sentient life
Could
forms?
still get you burned at the stake in Mississippi.
Yeah, I mean, he really was dangerous.
Yeah,
Because that's an embarrassing question to this day.
Sounds like a pretty good astrologer too.
He certainly wasn't good. You know, his real trip was Neoplatonism.
We were talking a few moments ago that something that struck me, and I want to make sure it doesn't flow away in the river. The rich vocabulary of more traditional astrology and how what emerged from the dark ages that we are taught to call the Enlightenment when we were getting our educations was an impoverished language.
Yes. Not necessarily wrong, just impoverished.
Yeah, impoverished language. And I would, in translating that, this is not my main point, just a quibble. I guess I'd hesitate to sign impoverished. I would sign stripped down, cut back.
I don't see much of a distinction, but I don't have a problem with that.
Stripped down to bones.
Yeah.
Stripped down to bones, to essence, to core. But as I said, I'm still, fundamentally on the same page with you about this, even though you're much more educated about it than I am. But that the great torrent of astrology in its golden years, the 1500 years or whatever of its hegemony, and then we have this stripped down trickle that comes out of it and it passed down to us. But that trickle, there were other trickles that joined it, not astrological.
Yes.
The trickle of God bless Carl Jung and Freud. Freud was grossly underestimated, and then through the glass darkly. I know this is not your favorite word, but the theosophical tradition, as certain Eastern traditions entered the stream. Carl Jung in 1930 or something is asked, what is the most significant development in Western civilization? And he says, the coming of Buddhism to the West. And then he added, but it will take 300 years. You know, I mean, brilliantly prescient. He's up there with Giordano Bruno as far as prescience there, I think. And so the point that I'm making, and I guess I'm kind of locating myself on the map of the world. I almost said your map of the world, but it's mine too. And that is that we got a bare bones core language that survived. And that language was powerful. What was left was powerful. When you say there was much that was lost that was equally powerful, I just bow to your wisdom and experience there. I don't have experience there, but I don't have an argument against that. But I know that what we got was precious. And I know that it interacted with incredible vigor, with psychology, with relativity, with quantum mechanics, with the whole scientific metaphor, the uncertainty principle, which is such an excellent metaphor for unpredictability, free will, and all that you were just talking about. And that as we got into the 20th century, astrology working with an impoverished, I'll go ahead and use your word there, core language, that core became so charged and powerful, and we get the brilliant, life-changing work, just speaking autobiographically, that came from like Dane Rudger, Mark Edmund Jones, the old ones, Liz Green more modernly. There was an astrologer in the 70s whose books knocked me out, a guy by the name of Robert Hand, who was operating in the modern tradition. And there was this renaissance occurred that was fueled partly by the vigor of astrological symbolism, but significantly by the vigor of its hybridization and union with these other traditions. And that's where I stand.
Let me carry you one step further, because I'm not going to contradict that. That was the blessing of the 18th century's contribution to astrology, that it did allow astrology to attract some new stuff and get involved with it. And in particular, the greatest contribution of the 19th century was the fact that it occurred to people that a spiritual astrology was possible because there wasn't a church to prevent it.
Good point.
And so they began laying the foundations of it. And the idea behind it, I think right from the beginning, was absolutely solid. My only problem with 19th century theosophy is that it is impoverished, warmed over late classical Neoplatonism. And I've been studying the original, and it's vastly richer. And it's given me a greater appreciation of Hinduism and Buddhism, but from the point of view of an equal, not a "oh, humble East, can you teach me" kind of thing. And this is becoming a very powerful formative influence in my own astrology. And every time I talk about the major contributions of the 20th century to astrology, Rudyard and Jones and the idea of humanistic and transpersonal psychology is it. That's the big one.
Yeah.
Because they took the ideas that the 19th century had sort of poorly formed, but were working on, and actually stated it as a mission clearly and succinctly, leaving out only one thing, which they had to leave something for us to do after all, which was how you do it.
Yeah.
And late last winter, I gave a workshop called Revisioning Spiritual Astrology, in which I solidly applied these late classical philosophical principles to the idea of a genuinely spiritual astrology. I'm not saying the other ones aren't, that's not the point. In fact, I honestly don't know wherein I and evolutionary astrology converge and diverge. So I've been pretty much doing my own thing. Reading, the only thing I read are in Latin. I mean, that's it's my fave. What the hell? But I'm very clear that astrology has an important contribution. In fact, one of the interesting pieces of dialectic, which somebody's been talking about, I think you're talking about Hillman tonight, aren't you? Somebody's talking about Hillman. No, I guess it's in the afternoon.
It was this morning. It was Adam Ellenboss.
Okay. Well, Hillman was a beautiful example of the reverse process occurring because his psychology was heavily informed by a good understanding of ancient philosophy. And what I'm working on now, as you may have heard, is the idea that the lot of daimon gives you a way of reading, of interpreting the nature of the daimon for a person, or as I prefer to call it, the higher self.
Yeah.
And I have some of my own personal philosophical prejudices in there, which is, even though I believe that one must work to improve oneself, I've come to the conclusion that working to become enlightened is a waste of time. What you have to do is get the garbage out of the way, and enlightenment will naturally follow. So
I sound just like a Buddhist.
Yeah, well, I have more than a little bit of Buddhist influence in my thinking.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
The obscurations, the enlightenment is already there. You just got to clean the glass.
yeah, and since the glass isn't clean, you may already know it, but you're not acting like you do.
Yeah. That's the jamming on that. When I sit with a client for the first time, they come inevitably with prejudices and expectations about astrology, mostly formed by sun sign astrology and silliness. And so I'll often say to them that go choose astrologers out of the yellow pages, and you'll find that diversity of approaches, but it all comes down to two things. They're going to give you a personality profile and a set of probabilistic predictions or deterministic ones for your future. And I'm not going to do either of those things. And it's fun to demolish the basic premise there by, and I do it very simply and make everybody laugh, but gets right to the heart of it. I say, let's consider the phenomenon of your personality profile. And I look at their birth year, I add 5 to it, So when you're 5 years old, you had a personality, that of a 5-year-old. You've improved. The most cynical person in the world defending the idea that, people never change, they have no defense against that. They've all changed. I say, if you have a little enthusiasm for personal growth, you're going to do more of it than if you're just sitting there in front of the television blaming Barack Obama for things that don't work in your personal life, So that's the X factor. But even somebody like that is learning and growing. So evolution, change, is an observed fact. It's the basis of philosophical systems, but it's not a philosophical assertion. We change.
Yeah.
We grow. And my purpose here in doing this reading for you is to facilitate the process of change, to aim it, to clarify it, to streamline it, to render it supported by skillful means so you know exactly what it is you're trying to do here. And the aim of the work, the aim of the process, quite distinct from your personality profile in your future, is to get you to your deathbed with a smile on your face. That gets their attention, and it is exactly what I'm doing and what you're talking about.
Yeah. I recognize the fact that a fairly large percent of the population reaches a sort of plateau and stops evolving. That's pathological. We have to recognize that as an illness.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, because we're supposed to go as far as we can in the pursuit of what it is we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I always am very, very careful to say what it is we're supposed to be is in terms of our own inner dynamic. It is not imposed by a fate, by God, or anything else. It's us.
Yeah.
And except, of course, we are all agents of most of those things. But
Yeah.
I've started. I've been deeply immersed in Alan Watts for the last few years. I've always loved this stuff, but I found it all on the internet, and I've been listening with great enthusiasm. And one of his ideas that he expresses again and again, is that we are all the entire universe being experienced from a particular point of view. And in one of his books, he mentions one of his favorite lines is, "I'm not here to change you. I'm not a guru. What I am is a stand-up spiritual comedian." Why do I do this? Because I like to.
Yeah.
So you might ask, and I'm combining two versions of the story here. You might ask, who is doing this? Who is doing this act? Who is this Alan Watts? So, well, we might go to an astrologer. He actually says this in the book. And I asked him the question, who is this Alan Watts? What is his racket? And the guy says, okay, well, give me the time, date, and place of birth. And he goes away and he comes back with what looks like a crudely drawn picture of the universe at the time I was born. And he says, that's it. That's the explanation. And Watts says, well, of course, the problem here is he's thinking those things are actually causing me to be what I am. What he doesn't realize is they're not causing me to be I am. They're part of what I am. I am that universe.
Yeah. It's not causal, it's synchronistic.
Yeah. Well, it's more like all one piece.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things I learned many years ago from one of his books that I read a long time ago was the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, which is your God playing a drama, and you forget your God, so the drama will be convincing.
Yeah.
What I got from that was there's only one obligation: to do the drama well.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And who is doing the drama?
Yeah.
It's another Alan Watts title comes to mind. Master has gone to the mountain, cloud hidden, whereabouts unknown. You can think about that one a long time. So it was. I heard you use some of these anecdotes in your talk yesterday, and it really put a smile on my face for a variety of reasons. One, I share a birthday with Alan Watts. He's older, but and I've always kind of identified with him. And then synchronistically, it happened that in March I was given a houseboat to stay on for a couple of days after teaching a class up in Sausalito.
Oh, they're still there. Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah, they're still there. And I was sitting on the back veranda, or whatever you call it, of this houseboat, gazing at Alan Watts' boat, where he wrote a lot of his work. It was right across the water, like 200 feet
I
away.
take it it's some sort of a memorial now?
I think it's still actually actively used by somebody. I think somebody just bought it. So it's just another houseboat, big old thing, But it was famously where there was Alan Watts was writing there, and the boat next to me had a table in it on which Otis Redding had written, sitting on the dock of the bay. So it's like, there's Otis and then there's Alan. It was kind of a magic moment.
You probably know there was a long period there where the fair citizens of Sausalito were trying to drive out all them damn pictures of households, and now it's a major part of their tourist economy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and those hippies are all now millionaires. And Alan, your lines about him being the comedian, I giggled. I use a line a lot of times when I'm working with clients, especially Neptunian 12th house, Piscean family kinds of people, and it just gets right to the heart of the matter. I'll just look them in the eye and say, I sit here before you doing fantastic Stephen Forrest impressions. Yes, you're wired to understand.
Yeah, I understand.
Deliver the line in Las Vegas, if you're important enough, reference to your hometown, and everybody would laugh. The yokels would laugh. It's like, you are Stephen Forrest, but am I? So
is there a Stephen Forrest?
That's Forrest? What is the chart? And then bouncing back to your point about Alan Watts saying, I am those planets. And so this case of bone we have over our brains, the Western system has taught us to take it way too seriously as a barrier, and back to Hindus, Atman and Brahman are one, the chart, and the phenomenon it represents, this personality, the Western word, this ever fluid mask, this narrative that we carry in our heads that isn't real, isn't true, but if we have to be true to it somehow and keep pulling its thread, and there are efficient ways to pull those threads, and the success is ultimately the undoing of the belief system and the separate personality. I mean, that's that kind of language. It's my language. Mine, like I invented, of course not.
It's the language you use.
Yeah, it's the language I use, but I use it and you nod your head in understanding. And there's, we could have a conscious Buddhist, a conscious Presbyterian, a conscious human with us who would probably get the feeling of the truthiness, of those
From
words.
another Stephen.
Yeah, yet another stealing from yet another one. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's what we're about in this sacred art, and there's so many different ways of getting at it, and
that is, of course, the principal thing is that it is a sacred art.
yes,
Whatever you apply it to. Now, there are some applications which get a little borderline, to be sure, but
especially calling them sacred gets a little.
like how can I win in Las Vegas? That's a question I will not answer.
Yeah, me either. Although
I can tell
astrology,
you how to lose.
yeah, it kind of works for that kind. I mean, I'm sure you've had dumb luck in Jupiter times and stuff like that. I have. I mean, there are far deeper things we can say. But yeah, it's funny how you can use astrology to predict fashion trends and the stock market and
That's because they all reflect
yeah,
the process.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they may do it at a somewhat ridiculous, mundane level, but by God, they do it.
Exactly. And the Star of India would make a hell of a paperweight too.
People often ask me, what do I think about the two zodiacs? And I say, I think they both work, and I will use them both when I figure out how to use them differently at the same time. I can't use them both the same way. That's ridiculous.
Yes.
And the biggest piece of evidence is just how different Indian astrology is from Western astrology, or even in its relatively elaborated forms from the ancient to the medieval times. I mean, one of the things that has caused many people to get into astrology is that it has an extremely rich and powerful collection of symbols and ideas and techniques and methods and so on and so forth. And in my now very extensive studies of medieval astrology, I can say it is every bit as complex, except at one level, the spiritual.
Interesting.
But even in India, astrology is not used that much for spiritual purposes. It's more of a meat and potatoes operation.
Yeah.
Which way is my next bowl of rice coming?
They get their spiritual needs met elsewhere, I suppose.
So astrology in this civilization actually has to rise into that gap because let's just say conventional religion isn't doing very well.
Yeah.
But
nor is conventional science as far as giving any meaning to life.
Oh, giving meaning to life, forget it.
Yeah, doesn't even try.
Yeah, I think I might as well put this on the public record in a larger context. A year ago, last April, after the Grand Cross, which was nicely situated on my ascendant descendant, nothing much happened. Except about 2 weeks later, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was in a bookstore in California, and I was lecturing on the Aristotelian idea of the soul and its relationship to astrology. I discussed the intellective soul, the sensitive soul, and the vegetative soul. And I got finished with that, and I said, now we must all stop and consider the mineral soul. And I woke up. And I knew exactly what it meant.
Wow.
And I began realizing that I had, like most people, accept the idea that life was an emergent property of matter and energy. And I realized at that point, no, matter and energy are an emergent property of life.
Beautiful. Yeah.
It is the causal factor. It is the source.
Yes.
And then I began noticing Awazi was very explicit about this. He says, we think we're all separate. So you're going down a river and you're looking at the whirlpools that form, by the edge when they go around the rocks, and every one of those whirlpools looks separate, but they're all processes occurring in a continuous river. That's us.
That's us.
Yeah, we're vortices.
Yes.
And obviously we are structured by the entire set of relationships that are influencing the flow of the water around us. And although it's a much more complex process, from there to does astrology work is a pretty simple, straightforward process. Once you allow for the incredible complexity of it.
Yes. One system interacting with itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
The multiverse is the word that takes us beyond universe, I guess.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure angels laugh when we come up with constructions like that.
Well, I've got in dealing with Neoplatonism and its hypostases, and also Kabbalah, which has the same ones. I came up with a mathematical model. And first thing I say is that this is a model. This is not the fact. This is a model. Please remember, this is a model.
Yeah.
But the model implies a few things. That at every level of being, there's an infinity of them. I mean, it's like that Verizon commercial, I think it is, with James Earl Jones and
I don't know it.
it's a great ad. They're talking to each other. These two great actors with their wonderful voices. Yeah. Communicating in teenage girl speak. And he's hot like infinity squared, James Earl Jones saying that. Yeah. And no, it's not squared, it's with the sixth power at least.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's the universe. I think of Rodney Collin, the theory of celestial influence. Yeah. Well, that wasn't where I was going to go, although that's a pretty good illustration too. Rodney Collin had such an impact on me when I was young. And the opening of Theory of Celestial Influence, first paragraph, I can't quote it exactly, but it was like, we theoretically we can hypothesize the existence of a God, which by logic and reason would have to be all possibilities, everything in the universe, all the possibilities in the universe, all possible past universes, all possible future universes, everything that might have happened, even though it didn't, et cetera, et cetera. And it's this incredibly eloquent paragraph that just leaves you gasping.
That is taken directly from Plotinus as any.
Is it?
Yes.
I mean, jam on Plotinus. This will actually swing back to a comment that you made. So we take that gigantic enchilada that we've just referred to, and we divide it into 12 boxes, and there's the signs of the zodiac. Each of those boxes containing 1/12 of that infinity to the sixth power. They're big boxes, big boxes, and then something triggers a Sagittarian fellow, some transit or progression. And we know that something out of that giant box called Sagittarius is going to happen. But what? I just pity the deterministic predictive astrologers. One thing I've noticed about them, their accuracy is incredible retrospectively. They can always predict the past, but that I could have told you that. And the weird thing is they're always right in a way. I tend to put quotation marks around right, but accurate in their analysis. But when something is triggered in you, say, a transit progression, whatever arcs, it is your fate to interact with that archetypal field. We can predict with absolute fatalistic confidence that archetypal field and you are going to do a dance together. But what is actually going to precipitate out into this tiny little backwater of the universe that we call the three-dimensional human world and a 410 kind of human lifespan? What's going to happen? At one level we could say it's a crapshoot, but what I feel is a better answer. It's that, and it's where the quantum metaphors come in, where consciousness interacts with the archetypal field and determines what is going to manifest.
That's the probability field.
Bullseye. Pop the quiff, as they say. Yes. It's a totally modern language, but from what you're saying, I gather that it would be understandable to a Hellenistic astrologer 2,200 years ago.
2,200 probably not, but 1,800 maybe.
Oh, okay.
These actually putting it that way, no, it wouldn't be, because the average astrologer in that period was no more enlightened than the average astrologer is now, maybe less.
Oh, yeah.
They just had an incredible technical apparatus to work with.
Mhm.
The heavy duty thinking appears to have gone on among the philosophers. And the reason why most people don't know about it is the church did a damn good job of wiping out a lot of the works. We know about them because they're referred to, but we don't have them. The fourth book of Proclus's Elements of Theology, or Platonic Theology, for example, is missing. And we know from his comments earlier in the book that in book 4 I will describe, and it isn't there, because it's a completely astrological model of the universe. Yeah, I mean, can you imagine if we had that?
Yes.
Thomas Taylor, in his edition of it, attempted to reconstruct it, but it's not.
From what? The fragments or
From inference.
references and quotes?
And I think Thomas Taylor is doing a pretty good job of channeling these guys anyway, but I still don't find it very satisfactory.
Yeah.
So we lost a lot of it. Iamblichus, of course, there's only one nearly complete work of his that survived, and they went after him particularly because he was trying to create a Neoplatonic church to stop Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was richly ritualized and had all sorts of juicy stuff in it. It would have been a tantric Neoplatonism, or tantric Platonism, actually, not Neo. But Plotinus saved himself from obliteration by staying pretty much on the philosophical, mystical level, and as a result became a major channel feeding into Christianity.
Yes.
With significant revisions, of course. But there's a passage on one of his essays on beauty where he talks about, and this is relevant to what you were saying a moment ago, the sun there is all stars, and all stars of the sun. And each of them something predominates, but again they are all. Each is all is all, and the splendor is infinite. And what he's doing the best job he can is describing what you said, a universe where everything that ever could be, ever will be, ever was, is.
Yes.
And that is what it has to be. And that's the reason why I came up with this dimensional model, because the only way you can have an infinity of spaces is to have the next hyperspace up.
Yes, exactly.
So, and that also means what I said this morning, that the past does not exist. All that exists is your memory of the past. If your memory of the past has disappeared, that past is no longer real. Really is no longer real.
Yeah. Yes.
There's no objective past.
Yes.
Although there's a consensus past, that's called history.
Yes.
And similarly, the future. So now that we've disposed of the single past, which tends to lead toward the idea of a single possible future, then we have an infinity of past channeled through the present to an infinity of futures.
I love it. I get sort of Buddhist and say that the past 1 nanosecond ago, fits your description. The future 1 nanosecond from now fits your description. So there.
Yeah. In fact, we have no way of saying it quickly enough to catch it, because it's infinitesimal.
Exactly.
The only thing that is real is infinitesimal.
Yes. And in the infinitesimal, as you relate it to consciousness, in the infinitesimal, no narrative can exist. There's not enough space for the narrative to exist. So the narrative pops, and suddenly that spaciousness of the now opens up. Yeah,
and it pops by our visualization of the past with an anticipation of the future, with the present in the middle.
Exactly. As soon as we start thinking.
It's that's really kind of mind-bending. The idea of the infinitesimal nature of the present.
Yes.
Especially when we look out through a room and we see space, we see stuff, we see things, and that perception is an infinitesimal point.
Yes. All actually in the folds of your brain.
Yeah. I like also the model, by the way, that the brain does not create consciousness. It's more like a radio receiver.
I love that one.
That's not mine, believe me.
No, I've read it in various books.
It accounts for insanity and things like that. So the receiver's busted.
Yeah, and the modern scientific brain morphology kind of people, they're like the natives tearing open the radio to find out where the voice is coming from.
Yeah. Boy, Yeah,
as if it were in the neurons and the synapses and
rather
the
than
biochemistry.
continuous flow of information through
Yeah.
the space
Yes,
occupied by the
exactly.
radio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Through that nanosecond. So, where is that in my chart? The sort of fun question. I was on a panel once, I think it was one of the UACs, and it's like, where is God in the chart? It's essentially the same question. And a bunch of different elaborate answers. I had I think a real simple one, that God in the chart, it's a space outside the chart. And you think of what that is, that's actually the sky, the universe, kind of beyond the star field, so to speak, and that sense of infinite depth, it's really built into every chart.
Well, yeah, my other favorite one is where is the soul in the chart? It's just the whole damn chart.
Yeah, that's good. I like that, with soul being, it's like that soul and spirit distinction. And it's just linguistic, I guess, but
Yeah.
spirit is something, sort of vaster, and soul with more of the imprint of individual personality and the mind stream kind of energy. It's in the chart, and spirit kind of beyond it. And it's like,
that's a perfectly good characterization, depending on your definition of spirit. Because that's, I tend not to use the word because it's even murkier than soul, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think the concepts behind them are murky, but this is what happens when a language is impoverished. We have these two words that have exactly the same origin, and they're used differently, but differently by everybody who uses them differently.
Yes.
And result is you have a meaningless mush. I mean, to a theosophist, soul is very different than it is to a Platonist. And it's not a matter of one being right and the other one being wrong. It's a matter of agreeing on the bloody definitions.
And to a Buddhist, it's a heretical concept.
Well, it is the idea that it's a permanent.
Yeah, the individual permanent soul. Yeah.
Although actually I adhere to it, because the original permanent soul is immortal. It not only doesn't die, it never began.
Yeah, which is also sounding very Buddhist.
Yeah. Well, that's it. It's the idea that who I am at the moment has any essential reality. That's an illusion.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
You never step into the same river twice, as the old line goes.
Yeah. I think of the most banal of astrological interactions, So you're a Gemini, so you talk too much, You're a Virgo, so you're picky and critical, Stuff at that level. And you can even elaborate it, but it still has essentially the same intellectual structure of here's your chart, therefore here's your personality. And it's boring, obviously, to both of us, and limited accuracy. But the deeper statement is realizing, based on our conversation, how actively damaging that kind of astrology is. If I say you are your narrative, you are permanently this thing that you believe yourself to be. It's written in your chart. I speak for God more or less because I'm the astrologer, and I have the map of your soul, and your soul's destiny is to talk too much or be picky and put things in alphabetical order. And it's close enough to the truth that there's a worm on the hook. There's just enough truth in that kind of astrology that it gets people stuck in their personalities.
As if it needed to be stuck otherwise.
As if they, stalker, I guess. Yeah.
No, I am quite clear that while we may differ on the astrological apparatus we use for the purpose, what I try, especially in this last several months when I've started doing readings based on the lot of spirit, I don't tell them what their soul path is. I look at their chart and I identify what might be in the way. And then we discuss it.
Nice.
And because the object is for them to continue moving forward, not to get stuck where they are. And that I know we have in common.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're not. What you say is absolutely correct. If you define a person's essence in a static way, you have damaged the person terribly.
Yeah, it's an awful crime. I like a lot what you just said about that we use different apparatus in what we do. It's
I
kind of the
don't
essence
even
of-
know how different, frankly, but
Yeah, probably pretty different, but I also don't know how different either,
yeah.
because the Tower of Babel and the receding islands and all the comments I made when we started this conversation, I don't understand Hellenistic astrology or Renaissance astrology. I have that much knowledge.
Yeah.
I've attended talks, and so I know some of the buzzwords and some of the concepts, but I have very little understanding of them. I'm not proud of that. It's not a point of honor. I try never to make ignorance a point of honor, except perhaps relative to mass sporting events where I am a little proud of not knowing who the hell was in the Super Bowl and stuff like that. But even there, I maybe shouldn't be. But the reality is, life is so short, and the kind of astrology that I do it's a tiger by the tail. I'm incredibly busy all the time. It's popular. I'm booked a year ahead. I'm flying all over the place, and I know you know what I'm talking about. And just trying to find, I guess first and foremost, finding time to keep balance in my life and not just be the astrology machine. Is so critical to my spiritual health, which in turn is critical to being a good astrologer. I think, there's plenty of crazy ones who are techniqued up to here, so trying to keep the balance. And so it's a frustration. You and I get old enough to appreciate that life is way shorter than young people can understand, and it goes by so fast, and trying to find the time. It's such an exciting time to be an astrologer, and I have a piece of it, but it's all these other things going on, and I don't know what they are, and it's frustrating, exciting, strange, disorienting.
I would urge one thing. Don't be too upset about the narrowness you're seeing among some astrologers. I've seen that they're growing out of it.
Good. Yeah, that was very encouraging.
It's a product of, how do I put this without being too condescending? Okay, I can put it very nicely. It's a product of being at the beginning of a growth stage, not at the end.
Yes.
And the ones for whom where they are now is the end will probably not last very long.
Yeah.
Because they won't have anything to offer people as people get older.
Mm-hmm.
They have to grow and age along with the people they're working with. And eventually they turn into a fine wine.
Yeah. That's my great hope.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you have two very well-known astrologers talking shop. Any comments? Margie, what do you want to say?
Well, I'd like to hear from other people first. I was glad to see Bruce hanging in there. And, they both have some familiarity with, at least I would say, watered down, Western Alan Watts style Buddhism. But what they said about time and all of that really, it resonated for me, and I wondered what you felt about it in particular, Bruce.
You got to get off mute.
Well, but a lot of things they're talking about are streams of ideas that are exploratory and inspiring and things like that. It still doesn't bring in the element of where you know for certain what it is. Like I mean, those guys are both of them are quite entertaining, and also obviously have done a lot of work and put a lot of thought in it. But in terms of the Buddhist sense of realization and the understanding of how that works and what it means, is you come to levels of your own mind that have certainty and know what it is already. Like that's part of the deeper wisdom that is in everyone's mind. And it's a different flavor of understanding. I keep on coming back to that because that's what happens when you meditate a lot and you're also connected to a guru who has all that reality already, and he communicates it mind to mind. So it's just, that was wonderful listening to those guys, but it's still inspiring ideas based on inspiring ideas. And there's a reality or an ability to perceive directly what it actually really is. And that's what they talk about in terms of realization in Buddhism.
Would you say that their their version of it, for lack of a better word, perhaps, is rather abstract and more of a theoretical model than a real experiential?
Well, the thing is that both those guys have had a lot of experiences, and so it's like they have a deeper understanding of the mind and realities from their life experience. I'm just contrasting that with where, although it's rare among Buddhists, but you do see it, is where you actually have incredible realization. And when you have it yourself, you can actually sense it, and you can tell. It's just a different world of understanding. That's all. It's as inspiring and as beautiful as those two guys were. It's still like a slightly different thread of thought in terms of how it manifests in the mind and how the content dramatically changes. That sort of thing.
No, I think I understand what you mean. So, yeah, I have a lot to say, but it's all, from my, own very biased point of view. The guy on the left, Robert Hand, was the original partner of my first teacher in New York. So I came of age in that school of thought that he was talking about in New York. And the second teacher I ended up with was very much in the school of thought of cosmobiology. But those were all keywords around that time. I started studying in the mid 80s.
Right.
So that was really like the state of the art at the time, was the people they were
Right.
talking about, Robert Hand in particular, the guy on the left. And my first teacher ended up kind of specializing in financial astrology, which is like the last thing I would ever, want to have anything to do with. But I ended up with a woman who was actually an initiated Sufi herself, and also a Quaker. So that was her philosophical grounding. And she wasn't a Jungian per se. That was later study that I did, mostly actually at the Jung Institute, and I followed Royce's mentor, became the teacher that I studied with the most. But I didn't really have a teacher putting the two together. My teacher felt that it was redundant. She thought that it was its own psychological stream. And now what we are planning to share next week is the latest work, which is scholarly work by my favorite astrological writer, who is also a Jungian analyst and writer. Jung's psychology was incredibly influenced by his study of astrology. So it's interesting. It's the other way around from what I kind of grew up thinking. So it's interesting to see, you know, the sequential development of it all it has its own integrity and its own reality. But so that being said, so I'm very fond of Robert Hand, and his work has really shaped my thinking a lot. He's kind of the godfather of modern astrology. And some of the others that they mentioned, one was Liz Green, and another was Dane Rudger, who was, he lived to be about 100 years old, and an incredible philosopher and psychologist in his own right, from France, but emigrated to California, I think in the 60s, or maybe even earlier. And so it's very healing for me. In my last 10 years, I've been away from it all and going through this extended trauma and legal drama. So for me to get back in the flow of this, and that was a relatively recent conversation in 2015. So for me, it's very gratifying, and I'm very grateful to Bart, because that's been a lot of what he's been doing for me in the past 2 years. But I'd like to hear more of what other people's impressions were, because for me, I could do that all day. That's listening to people I'm very fond of and admire a lot, talking shop, you know, about our subject. So for me, it's a treat to hear their inside views and their, you know, there's exchanges with each other. And clearly Robert Hand is the senior, and Stephen Forrest is, you know, deferring toward him, but Stephen Forrest is no lightweight either in his own right. So I'd like to hear more from other people. How did it strike you? I'm curious.
So I can comment. It's Cheryl. I just had to get over and unmute. I found it fascinating because I had done a little bit of studying of astrology in the early 80s, and I was fascinated by it, but I really didn't get too deep into it. And now I'm trying to like learn more about it, and I'm realizing this is a very deep subject. You have to do a lot to even begin to try to relate all the componentry. So I feel like I'm just at the beginning of wanting to at least try to understand it from a basic standpoint. And so it's kind of reopened I feel like it has been, I mean, it's an ancient practice, and that it really in the Western world was dismissed, probably, as they said in the video, because of religion. Christianity would be the dominant Western religion that kind of didn't like that there were other forces at work of controlling or influencing, you know, humans. But I find it curious to know about that in Buddhism, that do they not at all look at astronomy or the stars or the planets at all in any way to get at, you know, the oneness in Buddhism? I'd like to ask Bruce that. Like, is that at all, or is it just at such a different level that it doesn't relate?
Well, not in the teaching that I had. Basically, the teaching I had is you find all the answers on the inner, not the outer is not necessarily referred to hardly at all. I mean, in the early, when I first started, the charts were being done for everyone, including him. And it was interesting, but it was sort of like an exercise to look at what you are like and what your experience is. And his overview was now you have to fill in the rest of the chart. Like you were born with tools. Those were tools you were born with. Now you expand from there. And that's about as far as it went.
I thought that the houses with planets in them in the chart are showing what you're predisposed to be actively working on, but that part of your job in this life is to fill in the blanks.
Right.
So where you don't have a lot of active energy, and the second half of your life actually becomes more important.
Right.
That's also where you're working, not just the tenanted houses is how they're referred to. So, you know, that's kind of another way of saying just what you just said. And the idea is ultimately to transcend it. You know, I don't believe we can totally, but to express it on as high a level as possible. And that's not written in the chart. I don't think any astrologer would ever say that. You don't know when you're looking at a chart if it's a chicken, you know, or the date of a car was made. It could be anything. So the level of it isn't written in stone.
But it seems to be, given that, you know, the 12 months of the year that we use, you know, in the West, and I think we use throughout the world, you know, the calendar, that has got a basis in astrology. I mean, astronomy and astrology. And that most of us don't really make that connection. When you think about, you know, just the days, the hours, all these things are that there might actually have some influence on us because of the energy of where we are located in every moment of the, you know, of time. And as we rotate around and planets rotate around and all this stuff, and we go through the cycles, it probably does have an impact that we're not understanding, or I certainly am not understanding, but I perceive that it has to have an impact on us in some way. And that's fascinating. And it's so ancient too, that makes me think that there is something to this that makes me want to learn more about, just to be able to have a first level understanding.
Well, I think that's wonderful. I started studying it because I was having all these experiences of synchronicity. And they were actually disturbing. And I wondered if astrology might be something that would kind of explain it. And I was reading Jung as it was, and I kind of had this inkling that there might be something there. But I was really kind of still skeptical when I started studying it. And I realized I was just looking at it theoretically and getting into the philosophy of it, that I wasn't going to understand it until I started to study the how-to of it and the mechanics of it, because it is a technical language. And that until I started learning those technical nuts and bolts, I wasn't going to be able to make any evaluations. It was just like, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. But as far as it being anything accurate or meaningful, I spent a good year studying on my own, and then saying, I've got to find a teacher. I've got to get down to, you know, brass tacks to really make any kind of decision about this. I felt called to it, but I didn't really know why. And the first teacher I studied with was Robert Hand's partner at the time. And that was interesting, but kind of disappointing. But it was totally, I don't know how to put it. It was it was an instinct. And as I said, I was very skeptical. And then I spent like a year on my own again, and I'm frustrated because I was just reading, great ideas, but I wasn't learning how it might work even. And then I found my second teacher, and she had me start over from the beginning with her approach. And she had studied in the same, the school that my teacher had founded when she was much younger, and then they hired her later after she studied elsewhere. It wasn't until I started seeing it in action working that I started to really understand it. And it's like this conundrum. How are you going to understand it without believing in it? But I didn't believe in it. I had no reason to believe in it. I didn't come at it through even the sun sign astrology. I barely knew that my sun sign was Pisces. Didn't really make a lot of sense to me, but I was glad when I saw it. I said, oh, well, that at least I like them, and it made some sense to me. But my chart is what's called a scatter chart. So I have some planet in just about every single sign. There's 10 planets, and they're in just about every possible other sign. Whereas Bart is the exact opposite. He's got, I think, like six in one. His ascendant, his moon, his rising. Well, that's the ascendant. They're all in the same sign. So for him, if somebody just talked about Scorpio, that would make a lot of sense. But that's because he's got everything in it. His moon, his Mercury. For me, that Pisces is almost like the least of it. So, all of these things are very random. I just wanted to say, for me, the favorite part of it was when they were talking about, well, I like the Alan Watts passage. They talked about it as a language a lot. And they said, so somebody with Neptune, Pisces, 12th house, those are all different ways. Those are different parts of speech, really, for saying the same thing. Neptune describes a kind of energy that expresses in a planetary form as Neptune, in this form of signs that it corresponds to Pisces. And in terms of houses, it corresponds to the 12th house. And that's the way I learned to teach it, was to take these parts of speech and see the parallels, so that it's not 36 random parts. It's 3 times 12. These 12 things have correspondences. So you could have a verb form, you could have a noun form, you could have an adverb form for these different expressions of these very similar concepts. But I lost my point of what I wanted to say, that it's all happening at the same time. So it's not like we're in the universe. We are the universe. We're inside it. We're not, and that's why it works. Because when we look at a chart, it's a snapshot of our solar system, not the universe. Our solar system against the backdrop of the zodiac, which is just a way of breaking up the sky into 12 slices of pie. So that it's the same thing. It's not separate. We're not separate from the universe.
I just wanted to show you, this is for next week, but Jung started off, and this is Jung. So he went with Ptolemy, which is the 2nd century AD. I don't know what that might be written in Greek, might be in in Egyptian, I don't know. And then this is the next one he looked at was from the 9th century, and it's all in from an Arab, but it looks like it's written in Latin. And then there's someone from the 15 or 1700 time frame. And again, this looks like it's written in Latin. So this is what Jung started with, these 3 books. So none of them are, you know, are remotely contemporary. Could you do anything? And then he started to look at these experiments by Rhine. Rhine was doing a lot of work with trying to statistically validate things like telepathy. And could you predict what the next card would be if the card were drawn? And so there's a huge amount of work that he carried out, these other people as well, all experimental in the 1930s. And finally, Jung got around to actually saying, now, how in the world do I actually do a chart? And so he took a class by this guy, Alan Leo, and he learned how to actually take a birth natal chart and construct one. And then he went ahead and did it. Well, so notice it's totally all over the place. He started off up here with this highly abstract stuff, and at the end of the day gets down here to something very nutsy boltsy, trying to actually, you know, what could I do now that I couldn't do before? So that's what I just wanted to share with you.
I went through a lot of periods of, you know, throwing my books at the wall and saying, this doesn't make any sense. You know, it's all self-referential, everything is everything, and it just, there's no rhyme or reason. And then I would say, but wait a minute, all these brilliant people couldn't have been fooling themselves that way. You know, Jung wouldn't, you know, fall for that. He would be able to trick himself into thinking something that dopey, or that just some self-fulfilling prophecy. So I had to pick myself up over and over again and go back to the books and back to the basics. And it wasn't until I found my second teacher, that was really like a kind of salvation. We're Facebook friends now. I have invited her to come talk to us. But that would be next year at this point. When I first asked her to come, she took like 10 years off from relationships and then met her soulmate. So I have a lot of resonance with that. And her husband had just developed a really serious heart condition and needed open heart surgery, which he had a few months ago, and he's doing really, really well. So.
And my contribution was to do this little thing on the physics of astrology, which Marjorie was beating me up over. Anyway.
No, it was a wonderful surprise. He hid it from me until he.
No, I didn't hide it. I put it right in front of you. Anyway, well, you all have that, and so you can look at my 2 cents for why I'm conjecturing that this is plausible, that it's not a lot of hooey or waste of time, that there really is something there. But
I think, Bart, you talked a little bit about that last week, right? You showed a little bit of that last week, right?
Yeah, and I handed it out to everybody too. You've got it. If you go look in when we sent out the recording, I sent it out with it. So
there was one thing that really grabbed me in that, and it was about, you know, the planets moving around and the force of that has an effect on humans. And you said it in one line, and I went, well, that makes sense. That makes sense.
It appears it's an inverse square relationship. That is that even the distant stars with the distant planets on them, you know, even though they're still there, and some of them apparently, you know, do exert some sort of influence, but the farther away you get, the less the influence. So you know, but I think, you know, we'll have to see what's going on, because it's influencing you. It's what Bruce said about it's really inside you, and these archetypes that are out there are in fact reaching you, and you're responding to them, and that is leading to your evolution in all of this. So
Each planet corresponds to a metal, and we have all of those metals in our blood, So it doesn't have to be as simplistic as magnetism, but it could be just some kind of a vibrational sympathetic response, that the copper in our blood responds to the copper in Venus, and that somehow those archetypes as dark matter, this is a new, theory for me, a new postulate for me, is that they're dark matter, that they had their existence long before we were here to perceive them. And Jung didn't see the archetypes as something that we're living. That's was sort of how I started to think about it. He said, no, they're living us. No, I think I got that backwards after all that. They have a life of their own, with or without us. And we end up in that stream somehow, I think, with something that's kind of like magnetism. And there seems to be this imprint at our time of birth. That's a mysterious thing. I don't know why. I can't explain that.
well, the only thing I could think of for the time of birth is that that's the moment at which the soul joins with the physical body. But I don't know. I mean, Bruce, do you have any comment on that? Does that make any sense?
Well, the birth chart is when you come out of the womb. So
It's the first breath.
Yeah, the first breath, that's what the nurse or doctor notates on your birth certificate. You were born at this minute.
Well, that's said to be the commitment to the earth plane that the soul is making.
well, I remember being born.
Wow.
I remember being conceived and all that. And like when you're born, like you all of a sudden are in a different universe from being in the womb.
Mhm.
So it's like a rebirth in its own right. So,
Right.
And you're outside of the womb and you're exposed to the vibrations of the outer universe. When you're in the womb, it's a very different, there's a kind of a bonding, love bonding with the mother and the psychic of the father. And that's your world. When you come out, there's a lot of pain in being born. And
Shock, I think, yeah.
and it's a whole different reality that you suddenly find yourself in. So a lot of things happen.
Sure.
Did,
No, that's interesting.
did Nancy have anything to say?
Oh, you're muted. Hold on.
Yeah. I think it's I find astrology interesting and have some life experience with it. Very not my own studying. I've tried, and it is very complex and I think difficult to take on yourself. You really do need someone to help you kind of muddle through a lot of it. But my grandfather was an astrologer, was part of the whole Astrology Association, and used to go to the huge conferences and did charts for people all over the world. But back then, obviously, they did it all by the calculations by hand. And I have my chart.
Is that your mother's father?
No, my father's father.
Really? Oh, okay.
And he he did my chart, but there was question as to how sometimes how accurate based on their numbers that they would get, or the calculations that were done, and having to recalculate based on longitude and all that kind of stuff. I think sometimes they could be off, but it is very how do I want to say, there's much more to it, I think, than our society kind of has reduced it to, which is very sad that it's seen as such it's not given its credence, that it doesn't receive as much weight as, what we don't know, we kind of dismiss, right? Or what we can't understand, it easily gets pushed aside as gobbledygook, or as somebody's crazy ideas.
Real astrology has less to do with sun sign astrology than
Right.
anything. I don't even know sun sign astrology.
Yeah. I mean, I know little bits of it, but there's also an interesting correlation between some of this and obviously Steiner's work, because there is a lot of addressing the different minerals and how they correspond to certain seasons and spiritual holidays, and what minerals or what forces are at play in that time, and it's all very complex, and I don't know any of it. Just you read here, you read a little bit there means nothing, because there is so much.
It's one thing that I thought, well, if I'm gonna do my chart, I better really figure out where was I born. And so I did a little experiment, since I wasn't, not experiment, but a little bit of research, like, okay, that was a long time ago. So I had the address, well, I did the history, and I looked into the hospital where I was born in Pittsburgh, and I found some old reports on the hospitals, like exactly where it was, and then it grew and moved. And so I was able to get the actual street address when the year I was born. I thought, okay, it's still a big building, but at least we're getting closer. And then I correlated that with the longitude and latitude on the maps. And so I thought, okay, this is starting to feel like it's reasonably close. But that was kind of fun. And then my mind starts going into, well, how precise is precise? How precise do we need to be? And then I actually found my birth date on my birth certificate. I actually found the time of day only on one of them, not the one that was handwritten at the time, but the records, the census records or birth records for Pennsylvania. I had to get, we lost my birth certificates some decades ago, and I got the new one, and it actually had my birth date, birth time. So I was like, wow, look at that. But yet it wasn't on the handwritten birth certificate. So
there's two forms in use.
Okay.
One is the short form and one is the long form.
Okay.
So if you are ordering a birth certificate and you want the time, you have to be careful to ask for the long form.
Yeah, so I got it, and I was really excited. But I also was thinking, I'm hoping that the universe has trained the people that are recording births through, not through, through more spiritual means, or, other means, to know the importance to try to be accurate with that. Like that it's it's in the consciousness to better get this right. And so I decided I'd let that be and not try to have to worry about it anymore. But at least I did that homework. But now there's now I have to, there's so much to learn, and it's really, it's interesting to me.
I'm glad you think that way about it, and I'm glad you had that experience. There's a process, it's a mathematical process called rectification. And you can reconstruct, working backwards, the exact time of birth. If you have, they say, to work with like about 10 meaningful events in a person's life. So especially if they have children and you can get the exact date and time of their children's birth, that will really help. If you can get, the date of their marriage or divorce, those things will help. And then they've learned doing that a lot. Most people are born technically about 4 minutes before it's recorded. That's just kind of the average. And I had that process done by a Canadian astrologer, actually. And that was the case. The time on my birth certificate said 9:30. And when we rectified it, it came out pretty precisely at 9:26.
Wow, wow.
So that's what I use.
I was wondering about that too. I'm like, so who calls it?
Right.
When do they call? This is like, your time of birth. I mean, these
When the
kids
nurse
are
looked at the clock.
right.
I mean,
No,
that's-
but what constitutes it? Did it when they cut the umbilical cord? When you scream your first thing, you have to be fully out. I mean, what is the actual technical moment?
It's the first breath, but
The nurse, when the nurse finally says, "Oh, what time was this child born?" and looks at the
Right.
clock and says, "That's what it is." They're not paying attention to, "Oh, he took a breath. What time is it?"
Exactly.
it's very often after the baby's cleaned up and they're cleaned up and they turn around.
Oh, I need to write that down. What time was it?
Right. So, but that's why we have this technique of rectification, which that's an interesting exercise in itself, going back over your own life with somebody, and that can be very healing too. But it is unbelievably mechanistic, and I don't really want it to be, but it works out. Well, okay, well, what was going on when you were 3? It looks like, da 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 da. And how about, and what the heck was going on when you were 8? And you can count and answer these questions. And, she'll say, well, how old were you when you fell in love for the first time? And it was there, So it usually, as I said, it usually fine tunes it to about 4 minutes before. We don't usually want to work with even numbers at all. So even if it's like 8:40, somebody's got to be born at 8:40, but we prefer 8:42 or 8:39 as as more specific. It's gotten better over the years, and for quite a long time in the United States it wasn't recorded at all, so you have to go by family records if there is anything, or there are people who specialize in this rectification procedure, which I don't. I'd love to take a class in that because it's very interesting. It's interesting to look at. What you do is you take planets closest to an angle and you count the number of degrees. Why the hell that works, I cannot say. I don't know. But it really does seem to. And when I was, my Mars is 3 degrees from my ascendant, that's when my brother was born. And it was very traumatizing for me, as well as for him. He had a really, really difficult infancy and brain damage. And there was a time when he was first brought home from the hospital, he was suffocating. And I thought they were killing him. There were all these doctors in the room, and I didn't realize they were trying to save him with this vacuum machine to vacuum out his lungs. And but I went pulling at all the trouser legs saying, leave him alone. He's my baby brother, leave him alone. Stop it, stop it. I had completely forgotten that until I was in therapy in my 30s. It came back to me and I asked my parents and they said, oh yes, yeah, you were very upset. Yeah. So, but that was, for me, it wasn't just the normal having a younger sibling arrive on the scene. It was definitely a trauma. So, so things like that, it's very interesting to validate. And I find it very uplifting in terms of the unity, to see that the unity of the universe works that way. It's, to me, that's endlessly fascinating. So we're really glad that everybody stuck with us and listened. We didn't hear boo out of Stephen tonight.
Boo.
So you're still with us?
Unfortunately, I learned that I have COVID just today.
Oh,
Oh, Stephen.
oh, wow.
I'm suffering through keeping my eyes open through this. So I'm immediately going to jump into bed the moment we end. Can I say? I expect to survive.
I hope you feel better. I had it last week or the week before. My mom has it too. So it's definitely sweeping everywhere. So good luck. I hope you feel better.
So sorry for all of you, Steve. Hang in there. You'll get better.
Yeah.
We'll think about you.
And you too, and give our best to Judith. Tell
Yeah.
her.
How are you feeling now, Nancy?
For the most part, I'm okay, but there's definitely like things still, my gut still isn't 100%, and I still have a little bit of a cough. So it definitely hangs on for a little bit. It doesn't go away quickly.
Sorry.
My
It's all good.
chiropractor just got it, and yeah, this new variant seems to be extremely contagious.
I'm glad I'm on the other side. That's good.
It should protect you.
Yeah. So get lots of sleep. Stay hydrated.
Yes, yeah. Well, and look at the tape when you feel better.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, it was wonderful to see you all.
Now you got your taste of what it's like to talk shop in astrology.
I had not realized there were so many.
We keep trying different things to see what works and what doesn't work.
And we
Okay?
didn't hear a peep out of Barbara either, and she's the psychologist among us.
I was just really interested to know that there were so many different forms, and there's so much. It's like in the field of psychology, you're a behaviorist, or you're a cognitive behaviorist, or you're this or that, and everybody kind of has a different take on the same subject. And it was interesting to me to find out that was happening in the field of astrology, and that for something that is so old and so sacred, we're still kind of quibbling about it. And I think that the simple thing that was most important for me to hear tonight is the fact that it is not deterministic, or does not have to be deterministic, that it's probabilistic. That was important for me to hear.
Yeah.
Well, they are two of the deans of modern astrology. Those two guys. So for me,
You don't have a Hans book that you.
I do. Well,
It's not handy anyway.
so to speak.
Yeah.
I it's really like my Bible, his book on transits. I carry it with me, actually. We try to walk the beach every day, and I usually spend some time just breathing and reading. It's part of my assignment for healing my lung issues. And that's one of the books that I always have with me. Is his book on transits.
It's so nice to be exposed to so many different things that I hadn't really, I had a little bit of awareness of, but really hadn't delved into it, and it's nice to be able to have that opportunity. Thanks.
Good, good. Well, thanks for sticking with it, everybody. And fascinating to learn that your grandfather was an astrologer. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought that was really interesting.
He did astrology. He also did palmistry. I can remember as a kid, he'd say, "Come here," and my hand would be up on the desk, writing, doing the lines and all that good stuff. And it'd be like, "Opa, can I go now? Like, have I, been here long enough?"
Aw.
So cool, so
Yeah.
cool. What an
Yeah,
experience.
I mean, one of the things that Marjorie's got with all of the software that's now been available is you don't simply have this pie chart for the natal birth chart, but you have also basically you should think of time running on the horizontal axis, and then just the oscillations of all the different planets going up and down, being shown there, so you can picture when things are getting close to one another very easily by looking at this timeline, and when significant events are coming up. So I think there'll be other ways to do it. People with the graphics that is now available
Yeah.
I think a 3D picture will do the job, and they just haven't. It takes some effort to write that sort of software, and make it again correct. You have to actually look at the ephemeris for all the different planets and moons and everything, and so it goes. So
You're looking at least 10 planets. We count the sun and moon as planets, and the outer 3 interacting with 10 planets.
yeah.
Like this. So it's
A lot of math.
Well, also it appears that some of these moons actually have some activity. So Titan, which is as large as Mars, which is a moon of Saturn, and you
Titan
have
is on Saturn.
yeah.
Okay.
And then you have Iapetus, it's a moon of Jupiter that has this incredible lake in it. That the whole moon is covered with this lake. So there could be, more, and some of the asteroids in the asteroid belt, like Ceres and so forth. There could be other things there. So there might be not 10, but maybe 50.
Right.
When the dust settles, and that's the sort of thing that computers are good at, is doing all that donkey work to track everything. So
I would never trust myself to do it by hand. I learned how. I wanted to, but it's just so easy to make a very simple mistake. And an hour will throw everything off by a lot.
Yeah.
And so if you leave out, a time zone change or something, it could be
daylight
serious.
savings
Right,
versus
right.
that it's all of these things. So
And there's little pockets of the country that don't change.
yeah, you have to have the actual geographic location,
Right.
latitude and longitude, so that then you can figure out what the time really meant.
And
So-
some people were born during daylight savings time, but the hospital didn't recognize it, or their parents didn't recognize it. And it could take a long time to sort that out.
Yeah. Anyway, we digress. So everyone
Okay.
have a great weekend. I cut you off. What did you want to say, Nancy?
No, it's all good.
Okay.
Hope everybody stays well.
Yeah.
Okay. Happy Memorial Day.
And your mom
Hey.
too. Yeah. you guys-
That's not a Canadian holiday, Bruce, but
You can be happy anyway, though.
okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. Have a good, bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Thanks for stopping by.